This presentation is about immune systems. Let's start by trying to understand how invaders try to get in and attack a body. We'll start with our pathogens. Some typical common pathogens: we have bacteria, viruses, and eukaryotic protozoans like amoebas, trypanosomes. All of these microbes are typical invaders that try to enter into an organism's body and cause disease. So let's start by thinking of things other than ourselves. If you think about plants, they have defenses, as well as a lot of the invertebrate animals. Their immune systems are a little different than ours, however. So let's think of our first defense against any of these pathogens, whether it's us, a plant, a tree, an insect. All multicellular organisms, our first barrier would be our outside covering. For us, it's our skin. For insects, it would be the chitin exoskeleton. For plants, that could be the bark, the wood. Anyway, this barrier, let's list some of these barriers. And these are in a category that we're going to call innate immunity. That means they're automatic. It comes with the organism. It's not specific to any particular pathogen. For example, there are chemicals that will attack many kinds of bacteria, multiple kinds of bacteria. It doesn't specialize on one specific species or one particular kind of virus. So these innate immunities protect against broad categories of pathogens. Our first innate immunity is the barriers. For example, skin or an exoskeleton. Another barrier would be mucous membrane secretions. For example, in our tears, we produce a chemical, a protein called lysozyme. It's an enzyme that is very effective at destroying bacteria. Other cells in our body also produce this lysozyme. In our stomach, insects, digestive tracts produce this as well. Also, stomach acid itself, the high acid content destroys microbes as they enter the stomach from the food that we eat. Sweat and oil glands in our skin lower the pH of our skin to the point where most microbes can't survive. Let's say these pathogens get past our barriers. Maybe a sliver, an injury, something cuts through our skin. The next line of defense we're going to call internal defenses. And they would include things like antimicrobial proteins. For example, a chemical called interferon or interferons are very effective at destroying or preventing virus proteins from forming. Also, there are chemicals that are called complement, which once they're activated, once the first protein is activated, it activates the second, which activates the third, which activates the fourth, and they act in a chain reaction to assemble a kind of a protein tube that will puncture holes in cell membranes and cause, water to gush into say a bacteria cell, and then just by osmotic pressure will burst the cell and kill it. So these proteins are not specific for any particular type of pathogen, but they work on many kinds. Another internal defense would be an inflammatory response. In an inflammatory response, damaged cells in connective tissue, like underneath the skin, these tissues have what are called mast cells, and when these mast cells get destroyed, get killed, or damaged, they release a chemical called histamine. Histamine is a chemical which will cause swelling. It dilates blood vessels, allows greater blood flow to the area, so that's why a wound sometimes becomes red, swollen, hot, and flushed, is the increased blood flow to the area from these histamine chemicals. That allows additional cells to travel, additional immune cells travel in the bloodstream to get to the area quicker. Kind of concentrates our defenses in that area of the damage. Okay, another internal defense are some cellular defenses that cells will actually engulf invaders and destroy them, such as phagocytes. Those are very typical cells that will engulf lots of different kinds of pathogens. Also, natural killer cells will recognize multiple different kinds of invaders and attack them and engulf them and kill them. Another internal defense that we have is our lymph system and lymph node. What the lymph system is a series of vessels or tubes that drain body fluid from all of our extremities, our fingers, toes, feet, arms, everywhere. It drains it back and eventually dumps the fluid back into the heart. And along the way, since the fluid is traveling through these vessels or tubes, it's a good idea to have little checkpoints along the way. So let me show a diagram of the lymph system. So here's the lymph system, and you can see as fluid is squeezed out of our bloodstream by pressure, out of our arteries, capillaries, and it enters the tissues. Eventually that fluid's got to be drained back into the blood system, or else our tissues continue to swell up with fluid. You might have noticed that sometimes that happens if people have some problems and you know, they'll have swelling in their feet or hands. So all this fluid needs to be returned into the circulatory system. So the lymph system, unlike the circulatory system, is not a loop. It doesn't flow from arteries through the capillaries back to the veins and around and around. Instead, the lymph system is just a closed system of one-way tubes. So the vessels start in the extremities and go back and eventually dump back into the blood system. But along the way, there's these series of checkpoints. We're going to call those lymph nodes. And what it is it's a concentrated area where lots of immune system cells can hang out. A lot of defensive cells are there, so any fluid passing through that area that may have viruses or bacteria or some invaders, some pathogen in has to travel through this concentrated area of immune cells in the lymph nodes, which allows them to attack and destroy the invaders. Some of the larger lymph nodes, we just given them new names, the tonsils and the adenoids. The other glands that are part of the lymph system are the thymus, which actually helps to produce certain types of white blood cells, matures them and helps them to differentiate into the kind of cells that they need to be. The T cells, which we'll talk about later. And then the spleen, which has a job in recycling blood cells and also working with the immune system like a giant lymph node. But since the lymph system is all scattered throughout, it's not centralized in one organ, you can remove lymph nodes and still not compromise the health of the body, since there's other lymph nodes to do the job of the ones that were removed. So sometimes during surgery, imagine if there's been an infection, typically, like for example in cancers, there may be some lymph nodes that have trapped cancer cells, and the cancer is starting to grow from that area, so they'll actually remove the lymph nodes in that area to prevent the spread of the cancer. Okay, so these are our innate immunities or non-specific immunities that all organisms would have. Invertebrates would have these defenses as well as vertebrates. And in addition, you can imagine some plants have these defenses as well. They have barriers like bark and cellulose in their cell walls. But if an invader gets past those barriers, one defense that plants often use is to stimulate cell growth, localized cell growth in the area, surround the invaded area, and then seal it off so it becomes a big lump. Maybe you've seen trees that have or parts of plants that have big knobs on them. Those are called galls, and a gall is just an area where an invaded area of a plant's been sealed off from the rest of the plant to prevent it from spreading.